Hello, my name is Buddy Childress, and I'm Executive Director of Needle's Eye Ministries. We are really happy to have you with us today for a monthly speaker series. We hope you enjoy it.
Thanks so much, Buddy, and good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for coming out in this terrible weather. I really appreciate it, and I'll do my best to make it worth your while. Several weeks ago, Buddy asked me to come and tell you my story, and I did that once before in June of 2006. That's over 5 years ago. And talking, for those of you who know me, has never been a real problem for me. Although I'm not a trained public speaker, I'll talk. I don't usually impart any meaningful information, but I can do some talking. But talking on this subject, this personal subject, is a little bit scary. And so bear with me, I'll do the best I can. Not only that, I am not exactly the poster child for having led a good Christian life, as you will find out in a moment if you don't already know. But I have trouble saying no to Buddy, so here I am. And although I'd rather just talk to you, he's going to give me the hook in about 20 minutes, and so I've lived for 65 years on this planet, and to get some of that in, I've got to stick to my notes or I'll wander off the reservation, and we won't get out of here before it starts raining again. Before we get started, though, let me ask you guys some questions and sort of see who's in the room. And answer with a show of hands, if you don't mind. How many of you are at a Needle's Eye luncheon for the first time? Great, great. How many of you heard me tell this story 5 years ago? Yikes, okay, well, at least you'll get a good lunch, Laura. How many of you are in a Needle's Eye small group? And how many of you know how long Needle's Eye Ministries has been in existence? What? 35 years, okay, good. Let's get started. What I have to say, I'll summarize so that if I wander off the reservation and don't get finished before Buddy runs me out of here, you'll get the message. And the Reader's Digest version of it, and I know this to a certainty. God loves all of us. He is faithful even when we aren't. He wants to be in dialogue with us. And it's never too late. But more of that in a moment. First of all, I want to tell you a little bit about myself, who I am and where I've been. Buddy told you a little about that. I was born the day after Christmas in 1945, so I'm about 5 or 6 days older than the boomers, so that's pretty old. I think the generation I'm from is traditional. I was born right here in Richmond, Virginia, into a life of privilege and opportunity. My parents were college graduates. In fact, both of them had postgraduate degrees. My father was a third-generation physician. My mother was a civic volunteer. My brother, my sister, and I were pretty much expected to be successful. There just wasn't any question about it, and never any talk about it. As a boy, my family lived in the near West End, first at 4303 Hanover Avenue, and then over in Windsor Farms, and finally on Monument Avenue. And Richmond in the 50s and early 60s was just a wonderful time and place to be a child. I went to St. Christopher's School, as Buddy suggested, which is was a lot different then than it is now, but the education was outstanding. They made us go to chapel. They beat us over the head with a Bible. They made us play athletics. They made us study hard, and we got a great education there. I went to camp in the summertime, another example of the privileged life I led. First at Camp Arrowhead, which was a day camp. The less privileged children went to Camp Sioux, and we'd hoot at each other as the buses passed. Then I went to Camp Virginia, which was an awesome experience. Coach Pitt, the track coach at University of Richmond, was the owner and operator of that. It was a very competitive place. I learned to ride horseback there, which has been a delight to me all of my life, really. And I was a pretty good kid up until I turned 16. And what happens at 16? You get your driver's license. So if you're a young man whose body is changing and so forth, and you're now able to get out from under the watchful eye of your parents, you do exactly that. My driver's license was freedom, and I took advantage of all of that. The rules applied to everyone but me, and I assumed no responsibility for the outcome of anything I did. There seemed to be no consequences. Either I got away with it or I talked my way out of it. I seemed to be bulletproof. Then when I was 17 years old, I was involved in a terrible automobile accident. I flipped the car. I think I was driving. I don't remember the accident, frankly. I have amnesia of it, probably mercifully to this day. I was out cold for a week. The cops came and told my parents I was going to die. But I woke up, and my first recollection is in the hospital with a bandage wrapped around my head. So despite that horrible event, since I had no recollection of it, I continued to consider myself bulletproof. Then in the fall of 1964, I traveled up to a little Presbyterian college outside of Farmville, Virginia, Hampton-Sydney College, the 10th oldest college in the nation, founded in 1776. And I was told when I matriculated that there's but one rule at Hampton-Sydney: conduct yourself as a Hampton-Sydney gentleman, which was subject to wide-ranging interpretations and varying thought, and I kind of was on the low end of how you interpreted that. In fact, I was so bad when I walked into a place and it said gentleman's room, I looked to see if anybody was watching because I didn't think I probably belonged in there. The college was a church school, and we were required to go to chapel, and we were required to go, and then we were required to have two years of Bible while we were up there. So I mean, I was inundated with things religious. They also had the college church, which was on the way to Fraternity Circle, my favorite place, that is the Fraternity Circle. I don't recall ever having been in the college church, and I'm not proud of that, but fraternity life was just a whole lot more important to me. In fact, I even logged a little time in the Farmville jail, 4 evenings in the Farmville jail. I haven't got time to go into that. But I did see Judge Hay, who put me in there years later at one of his relatives' funeral, and I said, Judge Hay, back in 1967, you put me in jail for 4 days. And he said, oh, I'm sorry. I said, no, sir, justice was done. It was a perfectly appropriate sentence. Anyway, I was down at the fraternity house one evening. It was homecomings, I think. There was a big party going on, and all of a sudden I looked over in the corner of the living room, and there stood this professor who was about 80 years old, Dr. Allen. He was in the psychology department, and I walked over and said, Dr. Allen, what are you doing here? I'd never seen him there before. I've never seen him there since. He said, well, I'm a member of this fraternity. I was a member back in 19, and he mentioned some year long ago in the past, and I just wanted to come down for homecomings. He said, well, but Doug, what are you up to? What do you want to do when you get out of college? I said, well, I mean, that's 3 years from now. I haven't thought about that. He says, well, you need to think about that. Did anybody ever look at the aptitude tests we gave you and tell you about those? I said, no, sir. He said, would you like for me to do that? I said, yes, I would. So he put a note in my mailbox, and I came, and he said, I've looked at these. Have you ever thought about being a lawyer? And I said, no, that sounds interesting, though. He said, well, I think these aptitude tests show you've got the arrows in your quiver to be a good lawyer, if that's something you'd be interested in. I said, well, great, thanks. He said, but you're going to have to mend your ways. I said, in what way? He said, you're going to have to start coming to class. So I started doing that, and I ended up with being a late bloomer in college, buddy, and it all worked out. As my senior year was winding down, it was the Vietnamese era, and back in those days, later on they had a lottery. I always thought it was fascinating. To go and fight for your country, you had to lose the lottery. There's just something wrong with that. But this was before that, and the choices were, after you got out of college, you lost your college deferment, you were going to go in the military by draft, or you were going to join, or maybe you could get in the reserves. And the waiting list for the reserves was very, very long, so I had no plans at the end of my college days. I had no job. I was waiting to get drafted when a phone call came, and this sergeant said, Mr. Rucker, it's this sergeant, whatever his name was, and we'd like to know if you're interested in joining the 276th Engineer Battalion. And I thought, well, gee, this is a pleasant way to get drafted. It turned out it was a National Guard unit, and how that happened, I have no idea, but I'm 6'6". The nearsighted Viet Cong soldier would have shot me between the eyes the moment I stepped off the boat. I was such a big target. So I was happy to get in there, and that permitted me to go to law school in the fall of 1969. I went to the University of Virginia Law School, which was a fabulous, fabulous experience. One of my professors, you might have heard of him, Antonin Scalia, who now sits on the Supreme Court of the United States. I mean, that just shows you the caliber of the professors we had. and I graduated in 1972, and I passed the bar exam. And in the summer of '72, I started working for Sands Anderson, where I've been working ever since. And in August of 1975, my beloved daughter Meredith was born. And in 1979, my father died. He was my best friend. That was a tremendous loss to me. I was now the head of the family, and I felt like I had a lot of responsibilities, and I frankly had a fear of failure. I felt a big burden. Of course, I couldn't admit that, and I couldn't talk to anybody. You know, we in the South try to keep up appearances. Come on, let me see some nods. I know you all know what I'm talking about. So I found that practice of law was very, very competitive. And to survive, I realized I had to build a client base and I had to get good results. And that would take an enormous amount of time. It takes a lot of time to do it right. So I made the practice of law my top priority. In fact, it became an obsession. And everything I did was aimed at networking, business acquisition, and handling client engagements. So how did I do? Well, I was pretty successful by some standards. I developed a thriving law practice. I became a partner in my law firm. I handled some very big cases and some very big deals and was on various business and civic boards. I was elected president of the Virginia Bar Association. I also lived in a fancy West End neighborhood. I drove a nice car, wore tailor-made clothes. I belonged to the right clubs. I put my daughter in private school, and I made a lot of money. I was in control, a master of the universe, as Tom Wolfe said in his novel Bonfire of the Vanities. I had it made, right? Absolutely wrong. Really, I was running scared. I was staying busy, never taking time to stop and think about life. My then marriage was failing. My home, in fact, was a marital war zone, and I'm not at all proud of how I behaved during those times in my life, but I have since been forgiven for that. I drank too much. I did a lot of things I was not proud of. I was ignoring core values. I was a secular overachiever and a spiritual underachiever. And I intuitively knew that things had to change. And change they did.